Okay, I'm really delighted to be here, and I thank both conveners and others for the chance to speak. If my computer will work, yes, please. Okay, I am going to try to put a face and a body on some of the humans that are part of the story, because what's striking is how bad the terrestrial record is for the Sahara, because whenever you go out and work, and I think that Stefan gave a good idea of what it's like to be in the Sahara. It's my favorite place in the world, but it is a challenging place to work, and it ends up deflating most of the evidence that exists in these ephemeral environments. And so it's surprising how little we know about the actual people. And so I was, I'm going to be speaking about work on a place I call Gobero. It's in central Niger. And it's work that was done by a large group of people. And, the team involves first sort of an Italian subgroup, Elena Garcia. I originally brought to Gobero, and she brought some colleagues from Italy. And then I've assembled a larger group of some French, some American, and colleagues from Germany and England and elsewhere to try to understand Gobero. I will admit at the beginning that there was a difference of opinion on what I'm going to present today, and Elena has presented an idea that I think might be regarded as more traditional. We've already heard some references to it, that the later people in this area are pastoralists, and I never saw the evidence for that. I still don't. I don't believe there's hardly any evidence for that whatsoever. And that's actually, as Stefan was pointing out, is a very interesting thing, that people do not necessarily need to start producing food if, as Sutton proposed back in 1977, they live in an environment that is providing enough hunting and gathering to subsist. And ironically, the greened Sahara seemed to have provided that over a long period of time and over a large geographic area. And so I'm not going to mention most of these people, but they are responsible for a lot of this work. The dating work was done by the late Jean-François Saliège, and now by his protege, Antoine Zazo. There's a lot of other work on lithics, and also Elise Dufour on otoliths and strontium isotopes and all sorts of other things. I didn't go there to find humans. I normally work on archosaurs in the Mesozoic. It's one of the great hunting grounds for these kinds of animals. So I found, 80 to 100 tons of this kind of material, and I've gotten good at excavating it, preparing it, studying it with the modern tools of paleontology, which often involve now CAT scanning and reproducing things and assembling very fragile items, sometimes large, sometimes small. We go and CAT scan things. This is the endocast from a dinosaur, so that we can understand the internal ear structure and the posture of the animal and so on. This, like Stefan, requires the ability to put up with temperatures and other kinds of conditions. I won't show burning trucks. We were stuck up once in the desert, survived that rather well. And the last time I was in Niger, and I've worked all over the Sahara, I had an armed guard of 40, which I regard as a good way to contribute to the local economy. And you bring teams that can withstand these kinds of conditions. And so there's a lot of people who are now young professors on this team that collected some 20 tons of material. Well, one day, and the sites in Niger, just to say one last thing, have been known for a while, archaeological sites. Not paleontological, but archaeological, have been known for some time. In fact, has been the French focus for a number of years in Francophone countries, and especially Niger. But it led to a question by someone who actually reviewed all the archaeological evidence of the Sahara and Hur in a paper and said, where are the people? For stretches of thousands of years, there's evidences of all the artifacts deflated. Where are the people that were living there in supposedly such great numbers? And I chanced on a site that had a lot of these people, hundreds of them, buried in a place that nobody thought they would look. They didn't think to look there because normally the attitude of an archaeologist probably has a parallel in the paleontological world, is to look around refugia. Refugia, places where people would would hide in times of duress, the higher places, or places perhaps that had water. But one place that was not looked at was the heart of the Tenere Desert, a peneplain of Cretaceous rock, that flat area, subject to winds and generating much of the dust that some people are coring on the side of the Atlantic. Why would anything be preserved here? It was, in fact, an area of great deflation, an area where you could look at the basement rock, the Cretaceous, for dinosaurs. Well, on the left there, that little elevated structure is a structure of Paleodune sand held by what I've come to learn are calcretes and rhizoconcretions by the geologists who really brought meaning to especially the second term, rhizoconcretions. And in the middle, also, another structure. And these structures are Pleistocene and Holocene in age. And they house hundreds of human burials. And the area around, in front, a lake bed, a paleolake deposit, and then a short distance in the back, a gap of 110 million years, and in fact, you can find dinosaurs and supercrocs and things like that. In fact, I'm waiting for the time that we find a human artifact made from one of these bones, because clearly they were available to these Holocene inhabitants. So I wasn't expecting to find this. I actually went to Peter's alma mater and earned a geology degree there, so that was helpful in this quest. I also then went to the University of Chicago and taught 12 years of medical human anatomy, so I'm familiar with the human anatomy. And that is what was scarce in the Sahara, but abundant at this site. And so we found the largest, oldest graveyard in the Sahara. We'll talk about that. There's an enduring mystery at the site I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about. For anybody that collects things, and any archaeologist, when you can collect 100 human skeletons and find them right next to each other, and they are as much as 5,000 years apart, and you have one disturbed burial, one burial that pushed somebody else out of the way, and no more. You don't have a mayhem of bones. How this happened with the density of burials that we have at that site is going to be probably the enduring mystery of Gobero. It's a fantastic thing that is hard to explain. The only site with a 5,000-year span of burials where you really have habitation, you have garbage piles, middens, and other kinds of evidence of habitation for 5,000 years. That's equivalent to the span from the time that civilization, history began and the building of the pyramids to today. Just to put it in perspective. The best chronology, just because it is hard to date humans in the Sahara. Hard to date them because of radiation and heat. Destroys collagen. So you can't use normal C dating. You have to use bioapatite dating, and that's where Jean-François Saliège and Antoine Zazo came in. They were at the forefront of dating bioapatite in the bone matrix and especially in the enamel of teeth, and we use that extensively at this site. Window into funerary practices, bar none. It's going to give you, and I think you'll agree, an interesting look at these people. And double and triple burials, things we weren't ever expecting. So first I'm going to look briefly at the geologic setting. Gobero, again, is in central Niger. It is an area of several Paleodune sites. So these are those oval sand-colored sites that accumulated at the end of the Pleistocene and the early part of the Holocene, and were surrounded by a relatively small lake. What I didn't realize was so attractive about this area, because you have to ask, what is so attractive about this area? It's not a cliff-dwelling area where people can... What was attractive is that there is a rare fault, geologic fault, a small one by geology standards, called the Mazalette Fault, but marked on geologic maps. A vertical fault nearby that created a fault-bounded lake. Now, it's come to some attention of people studying human evolution that fault-bounded lakes are really tied up with human ancestry in a good bond, because water goes up to the fault, the edge, the cliff, and forms a waterfall, preventing the lake from expanding infinitely like it was in a bowl. It puts a control on the lake margin, and that's why people like it. And I think that was why Gobero was such a popular area for so long. It was a fault-bounded lake and a rare fault in the Tenere. It is possible to dig through the deepest part of this record. I took, it's not very indurated, so one takes one's life into one's hands, but I did go down the 3 or 4 meters until I hit rock bottom, Cretaceous rock, and then take some OSL samples, try and verify the age of the first sand that accumulated in this area. And the burials are all located in the upper meter. We tried to prove that. This is what the lake bed looks like. There was a Paleolake Gobero that surrounded this area, this popular beach resort during the Holocene. And it was teeming with all sorts of animals. Virtually almost any animal that you know from the Serengeti was there. And we have a great record of it, sometimes entire skulls or skeletons. We're talking about, I'm not going to talk about the fauna in detail, but we're talking about elephants, hippos, crocodiles, frogs, everything that would be in a savanna, wet savanna environment. Now, what is holding this site from total destruction and deflation, as is the case in all the surrounding territory, minus a few other pockets, is what Felix Henningsen has called, Peter Felix Henningsen, a geologist, has called swamp ore and calcrete. If you look down, you'll see a calvarium, a human skull filled literally with the calcrete. It's solidly cemented into this, and that forms what looks like almost an atoll around the habitation area and the burial area. It's clear from the thousands of artifacts and the millions of pieces of debitage that Gobero, I'm not going to say a lot about this for archaeological details, was not just a funerary site. It was a habitation site. They lived there, they made their tools there, and they buried their dead there at times in the past. And so you see calcrete examples, and you can see the roots growing down into this. That was underwater when that was forming. And over here, especially the swamp ore, again, produced by the oxygen conditions of roots of reeds, you're looking at water level that would have been about 1 meter higher than that rock when it was formed. This is what the fault looks like. These are dinosaur rocks, of course, because the Cretaceous is swept up by this little fault. You can find some of the rock engravings from very late times of the populations, the Maghrebi populations that the last speaker, Laura, talked about. But basic, because there are people that continue to live in this area despite the desiccation. But we're going to talk about the people that lived here when it was a more verdant place. And so this is, again, what it looks like. And here's an exaggerated cross-section. And so it goes right through those two sites, the sites on the left of this diagram. You see the Cretaceous, the green rock coming up. There's a certain amount of recent dune that covers certain areas, and it migrates. There's Barkhan dunes on the backside. But what has held this for the last 10,000 years is, and it's deflating, is that calcrete and the rhizoconcretions. The people who are living on top, at times, reeds surrounded this area, literally cemented in a periphery that has held these sites. Now, it wouldn't take much to inundate the site. You see, the sites are quite low, 3 meters or so, of paleodune sand. Once you fill water beyond about 3 meters in depth, so it's pretty shallow, 10 feet, 3 meters, those people, their graves, their living sites are covered. And we know this happened because long periods of inundation produce a color on the fossil that's on the fossil human bones and faunal bones that's pretty characteristic of pyrolusite staining. Up at about 15 meters, you're getting close to one of the low points in the fault, the breaking point where water would go away and people would maybe move to the margins but not have to move that far. So that's Gobero. And my goal was not to lose any information and to gather as much information as possible, everything I possibly could. And so I took standard archaeological protocol and learned it, but then added from my own field when I felt we would do a better job. And so for mapping, we laser scan the surface. We first started using total stations, but it's hard to find anything that's permanent out there. We, for example, could not find the French anchor point for the topographic map, even though they had it marked. And so we couldn't find sometimes our corner stakes put in metal rods the following year. So we ultimately brought a laser scanner out there and literally laser scanned the entire surface of Gobero and the fossil lake. This is actually a composite balloon photograph that we took from a helium balloon. We've covered the entire area photogrammatically as well. And so we can really locate where virtually everything is down to a centimeter or two. Very grossly, we're looking at two populations of humans buried at that site. The earlier population, I'm going to call Kithians following Desmond Clark. Desmond Clark did work about 300 miles north of here, near the Aire, in a site called Edouard Bard. It was just published by his students and acolytes posthumously. The Kithians and the Tenerarians, the subsequent population. Now, these were cultural terms more than physical terms, because basically the remains of humans were basically not found. And secondly, a lot of the cultural terms were based on composite ideas, really. I mean, because most of the artifacts, almost all the artifacts, were deflated. And so they were just sort of assuming things. And so this is sort of what the history, in brief, the geologic history of Gobero looks like when we diagram it out, thanks to the geologists and us arguing. And there's going to be some complexities because we have more calcretes to date and ore deposits, but this is sort of the overall picture. So back at about 15,000 years or so, we see the accumulation of these dune sands. That's the OSL date we get right from the bottom. We got several OSL dates, blindly gave them to the laboratory. They oriented them all in the right order that we found them. And so I sort of think the 15,000 date is fairly believable, 16,000 BP for the bottom. It accumulated up against the fault here. At some point, water came into the picture in the early part of the Kithian period. Now, there could have been a time, we're going to see, that what we just talked about, a delay from the time that people here are telling me the weather changed to much wetter conditions. I don't know how to explain that except that it doesn't take too much water to make Gobero unlivable. So maybe it was high water at 11,000 or 10,000 BP that prevented humans from living in Gobero. I don't know, but I can tell you, so there may be a high water phase here. I can tell you that people came to live on Gobero by about 10,000, a little bit younger, about 9,700 BP. There were people there, and they weren't interesting people. They buried themselves there and lived there, and then water rose and covered them for a good length of time. It could be right at the 8.2 mark. There might be more fluctuations, but clearly by about 8.2, they were buried underwater. We find no evidence of humans or any other animals datable in place past 8.2. That would correspond well with what we've seen. And then it dried out. And this again corresponds in general to a time period. We don't date anything to this time period. There's one mollusk shell that we date to this time period when it dried out. Then eventually the water came back, and a different kind, in this case, the pyrolusate staining makes it easy to identify most of the earlier skeletons. They're dark, they're almost black. A new kind of person moved in, or persons, maybe introgressed slightly with the previous population, but very distinctive in skull form. And about as distinctive as you'd get in any Homo sapien population worldwide, far more distinctive than even the settler versus the Native American. I'll show you some of the differences between these people. And eventually, we end up with a desiccation a little bit after the end of the African human period as normally defined. And people still live in the area. We find them as transients past 4.5 BP. So that's the overall. That's the overall, and the thing I'm going to point out is that these people are living and literally depositing themselves in the same burial ground at the same level. There's no statistical difference. You can walk 3 feet and find someone who's 3,000 years younger. It's rather staggering. Okay, so here's the chronology, and I haven't plotted all the latest dates up, but we've dated a small number of Paleozoic sediments, mollusks, ceramics, temper in the ceramics, enamel, bone, fauna, sometimes harpoons, stuck in the lake sediment. We dated those. and we came up with some interesting results. I mean, basically we see these two sort of habitation phases, and then a third habitation phase here, or fourth if you count a late Pleistocene, early Holocene time period here as one. There's epipaleolithic tools that we find deflated in the area. But there's two main humid period occupations. And here's the humans dating, these are the radiometric dates taken from enamel mainly and bone, in this case tooth, bone, and enamel all consistent. These are the consistent measurements from individuals. And this is the second duration of longer period. What we're going to do is going to look at sort of this first phase here. We've dated fauna and some other things to this phase. This is your classic aqualithic, if you will, Ibero-Marusian population. Not depicted here. That's this individual. There's classic dotted wavy line ceramics dated to this area. There's a lot of fauna from hunter-gatherers and classic. There's also a very dense area of burials that clearly would be argued to be a cemetery, because we've actually now completely excavated this area. This is 2 meters here to show you how dense it is. And there's several more burials there. None are disturbed. They all date to about 250 years back, 9,700, 600 years ago. So it's a very dense, and clearly this shows you some of the excavations to how close some of these are. Sometimes they have similar orientations. We couldn't find any overall. They have a very similar burial style, we'll come to see. So I think this is a burial cemetery. And here's 2 individuals, a double burial of 2 children, 4 and 5 years old. They're not the same age. But again, a very hyperflex kind of burial that characterizes this time period. Here's an individual. We called her Xena because, in fact, she was shot with some kind of arrowhead. This is actually pretty rare in the archaeological record. The lithic splintered in the bone. We tried to actually CAT scan it, print it, and put it together again. But this is pretty characteristic upon impact on a vitric lithic. And the person survived. The bone grew over. In fact, we never found at Gobero, in the 100 burials we excavated, anybody with a crushed skull or an arrowhead in their back, much in the way of the Iceman or anything else. These people from the early phase have very long skulls. They have an occipital bun. You'll notice the width of the skull here. This is a child. I mean, it almost looks hydrocephalic when you're looking at the child. They have square orbits. They have, they're not very prognathous. They have a pentagonal outline on the back of the skull. They're very distinctive, and when you look at the skulls, and the occipital, the foramen magnum is located well under the occipital bun in the back, and they're very long skulls inside view, very distinctive. And when you plot them out on a PC component, as Chris Stojanowski did, the skeletal biologist on the team, you find them, this group here, of skulls from that time period, plotting closely to the Ibero-Marusian population. So it's a population, as the previous speaker pointed out, the desert was very large prior to this time, pushing people to the very margins. Algeria, Morocco, Tiferet, places like that, cave deposits, dating back to almost Cro-Magnon times, 25,000 years ago, 20,000, 15, 17,000. This is the people, and also on the Iberian Peninsula and in southern Italy. Is this the Intu population that the previous speaker spoke of? Could be. They look very robust. They are very tall. This individual gave us some reason to try and figure out how tall they actually were. There's a cottage industry on stature. You measure a few long bones, you put it into a formula, but there's a better way. If you can measure the entire stature-forming part of the skeleton of a human and add a soft anatomy factor. And so we did that. We applied it to this skeleton digitally, and we calculated the stature. It hadn't been done before. So the stature of this individual in American terms, 6'2", really about 2 meters, very tall, very robust. And we went further just to make him stand again for fun, but also to, anybody can get this file and take a look at the morphology of the bones of the individual. We did disarticulate some, but in fact, the pose of this individual is remarkable. The hands are flexed over its mouth, It is bundled within 10 inches, or I guess that would be about 20 centimeters, 22 centimeters. It had to have been bundled. The feet are crossed. We found the position of every single bone. And I didn't know what was under it or what was not under it. So I wanted to collect it to find that in the laboratory. It would turn out there was some shards underneath the skeleton, and I know exactly where they are. So we could give somebody, an archaeologist or a human skeletal biologist, the morphology of this person, but still take him back intact. He's one of our oldest individuals, completely intact, so we can understand the burial position, which was very interesting. We would not, all you need to do is compare the drawings that we made in the field, which is what we would have standardly been left with what we actually know about this human now afterwards. And dotted wavy line and thick ceramics like this date to this area, and of course harpoons date to this area as expected. We have quite a few harpoons. They made them from two sources. We've sectioned them using crocodile bone as well as mammal bone. And we did find very few, but we did find microliths and some arrow points in some of the graves of these animals. Dating back to this period and found in their garbage piles is everything under the sun. Of course, lattes, the perch, and an assortment of fish, but also hartebeest, a number of different kinds of bovids and other kinds of animals, including hippo. When we move to now there's nothing found in this zone here except a single mollusk that likes sort of periodic water habitats. And then we have dates from a wide variety of things from the second occupation phase. Now, they're called Tenorians and are named after this disc, which has, sadly, never been found in place yet. It's missing a chip here. Actually, it's a circular thing, an oval thing, very thin, very difficult to make, and made out of a really interesting rock that I ended up identifying and differing from the previous. It's actually a felsite. It doesn't have quartz in it. It's a microcrystalline rock, and we found out where they got it from, because no one knew that either. Not far, as you might suspect. This is what they look like. This was one of the earliest skulls from this time period. They're much taller. They look much more ultimately like our skulls. And if you compare them, and I knew we could, we would get different shaped brains out of them. It doesn't have a huge meaning, but in fact the endocasts, which you can see here digitally recreated and printed, look quite different from an early Holocene human versus the later Holocene human. And they buried their people immediately with things. So this individual that I showed you the first picture of, the skull, was buried, in fact, in almost like a fetal-like pose. So it looks somewhat like the earlier burials. He's completely wrapped up. And on his underside, the most amazing thing, a turtle carapace. So his derriere was placed inside a carapace, and it was so tightly oppressed to his skeleton that his hip bones actually made this bulge. There was no other postcrania. I think this is prima facie evidence that they were put in animal sacks to actually contain the fossil so close to the skeleton. But it is a testimony also to the way that we collected it, because we were completely destroyed it if we lifted the bones up out of the ground, as it were. So now we can take the skeleton back, and we can look at it. We can, look at exactly the position of the turtle carapace, which you're seeing coming around here on the backside here. And look at the position. It is like a pretzel. It's hard to understand. You really have to study it. But the Tenorians did this with regularity. Here's a man with his head buried in a semi-pot, and over his head was I've studied this, the ankle of a crocodile. It's just amazing. And over his rib cage, and he had burn marks on him. These people really were doing lots of different things symbolically with their burials than the earlier people. And this is what the pot looks like reconstructed. It has a very unusual pattern under his head. But he's now buried on his side. And this is what the later people did. They buried children like this on their side. And here, in this 10-year-old, a reason to collect this intact is the first upper arm ornament. We didn't know what it was. It was almost ready to break apart when we brushed the sand off of it. It's hippo ivory, made from a giant hippo canine. And an upper arm bracelet, you'd never figure out that a person was wearing it there. Just rather amazing. And hippo ivory was one of the things that they used in abundance. So here's the most artistic element ever from the Holocene of Africa. It's just an absolutely gorgeous pendant. It was found along with these beads. These are hippo ivory beads. Here's an amphibolite. Here's a metamorphic rock from the Aïr somewhere. Rodent problems. There's a rodent that took a chunk out of this one. Here's the enamel on the classic hippo ivory. When you look at the pendant, it has a pattern on both sides, a bird foot pattern made by somebody that was right-handed. You can see it was worn centrally by the pendant mark there. This is an elegant and absolutely beautiful piece that takes the cake for one of the most beautiful pieces ever produced. This is my reconstruction of it. There's ostrich eggshell beads in the center of separating some of these beads, but we don't have more than just an educated guess as to what it would have looked like in life. Other burials, here is pollen from a holly-like plant, a plant that could only have come from the top of the Aïr, under her head and under her feet. Never found before at a site like that, not found in the general pollen samples from the site. And then a burial that was, I knew, extraordinary even from the time that I saw it eroding from the ground. 3 crania, too close for comfort, in fact, part of the same burial. It was a triple burial of a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 30-some-year-old woman. And artifacts found in different places. 4 unshot, unhafted arrowheads, never been used, with children and a woman. Very unusual combination. We found it several times at the site, and it really is one of the most interesting grave goods that we find at the site associated with women and children. But half of those artifacts were under the skeleton. I didn't know that until, for example, this one, right between the radius and ulna. I didn't know that until we found it in the lab. But how to collect something like this, it really is quite a challenge. So what you want to do is you want to take your samples first for pollen or anything else, and then you can use standard laboratory hardener to harden it enough to take it and do the rest of the preparation in the lab. And then you get something like this. It's challenging, but then you get something like this. So this is a triple burial seen in all its glory, top side. This is the triple burial seen in all its glory, bottom side, including the artifacts that were underneath it. And the fact, we didn't see this in the field at all, that the woman had her hands crossed in a very symbolic way, intergaging the hands of the 8-year-old in between. We have sectioned the molars of the 8-year-old and the 5-year-old. There is dental evidence that they're related. We know how old they are in terms of days. They don't have a similar stress history. This age range buried suddenly is remarkable. I think it was an accident. The best I can understand is that it was a drowning in the nearby lake. We know this skeleton now from 3 dimensions and can twist it around and look at anything you want. See how thin it is. It's, of course, collapsed in the sand burial. We can also relish the fact that our sampling pollen, just for good measure, produced pollen clusters. And so this is the likelihood, a floral structure, to get that much pollen. Many clusters of pollen of the same species, a Celosia-type plant that would look like this, were laid down underneath the skeletons because they were found by our paleontologists under the skeletons. So an amazing burial. Many artifacts date to this period from the burials. There's Amazonite, we'll return to that. The middens show, this one we collected intact and prepared it. Someone had collected clams from the nearby lake and was actually shelling them and stacking the shells. Some of the fauna was found articulated, like the snake or this complete turtle, on top of the site. It was taken there by humans. It had to have been. It was right on top of the site. What was conspicuously absent compared to Drarbus, were domesticated animals. We literally had 3 or 4 specimens of Bos taurus, this being by far the most complete. A deflated mandible, which we dated twice to the Teneraean period. They must have known about cattle. 300 miles, 500 kilometers to the north, was a site dominated by hundreds of cow bones. There were pastoralists there, without doubt. They met in the Aïr to make the engravings that are so famous. Surely they must have known about cattle pastoralism. That's what makes the site, I think, particularly interesting, to see a people living contemporaneously with pastoralists within a stone's throw of them, both accessing the same felsite quarries. And yet, no prevalence of pastoralism at this site. Perhaps it was just visited. We'll try, periodically. Is that why they're missing? And they were actually pastoralists, and this is their vacation home? I tried to answer that question. One of the ways you can sort of answer a question of what they were eating is to look at the plaque, the dental calculus on some of the skulls that date to this time period. We didn't find any domesticated grain. Half of it was grasses, fruit, evidence of eating fruit, wild fruit. We found in the same middens sometimes multiple patterns. This upset the ceramists because they're not supposed to be together, but we found them together, dated the temper as coming out the same. So I just have to try and go with where the evidence points. The Amazonite, we don't know where this comes from. I suspect it comes from the Aire. The only known Amazonite quarry is over in Libya. I doubt they were going that far for this rock. It's too abundant at the site. We found unworked, clumps of it and so on. So now we come to the final period here. Recorded at the site, we have pots. We have some pots with hearths, well dated to this time period. They're very thin, unpatterned. It was a transitory existence. We found no graves that date to this time period. And then you move into the monumental and historical periods, again mentioned by Laura, people that probably are Berber origin that brought camels into the area. We find their engravings. We find their tumuli, but we don't find them buried at Gobero. This is what their ceramics look like, typically painted but unornamented and quite distinctive from the ceramics that came before. This, in the Aire, 100 miles, 150, 160 kilometers away, as a direct shot, is a felsite quarry. So it turns out there's felsite coming. It's an igneous rock that comes to the surface. It's not a vitric, airborne rock. It's an igneous rock, has no quartz in it, comes to the surface. Here's a debitage from the site. We've got lots of tools from the site. There's 4 or 5 of these quarries. It's part of the Aire, on the eastern side of the Aire. It's a feature. And they were using it, and they were also using lots of different kinds of petrified wood and quartzite. They were using it in the absence of obsidian. This was a pretty darn good material for large and small points. There's been work on, this was found on the other side of the Aire. There's been work on these artworks. Stefan mentioned also not these beautiful and earlier engraved works that were probably done by peoples like the Kithian. He mentioned these roundheads, which were probably done by people like the Tenerans. You notice an artistic and cultural trajectory. Is it like Brooks suggested, that this is an example of just cultural sort of complexity and, as it were, deterioration? Almost like a Minoan Mycenaean. You see these beautiful, artistically, deeply engraved with leashes, depictions of natural history. And then you see this, which looks really elegant compared to what followed in the Berber scrawls of camels and so on. I don't know. It's just these people at Gobero were probably living. This is the Bozos in a bend in the Niger River in Mali. Probably living right near the water edge. We don't have evidence of their structures because there's no post holes or anything like that. They're just not preserved. We know they were living there from many of the things that we were left. I'm going to try to answer, and with Elise Dutour is out in the audience there, a little bit, any shred of evidence that would give us a time frame on the residencies of these people. Was it seasonal? Was it year-round? Certainly the children and all the artifacts and the evidence that they were living there is there, but were they semi-sedentary? Were they almost sedentary at times? So the otoliths found in the middens supply some first shot. So with 12 of these, they come from a spread throughout the year. And so the first shot at that, we're going to hopefully do a little bit more, is that they were residents there. They were not fishing seasonally at one point during the year. Now, how this matches up with what we've heard earlier in the talk, earlier in the seminar, onset, offset. I don't know why there's not a human record before about, this is BP down here, this is BCE. This is, about 9,700. We've got some more dates. We've got one little fauna piece before that. Could be that there was too much water there. We don't get ages back. Doesn't seem to be preserved, or it's modified lake beds back to that early time. It seems to occur a bit after, when the lake was at an ice level low. Maybe it was too wet. They persist clearly in good numbers afterwards, beyond 5,200 at Gobero. And quite frankly, we don't see much change as much as we can measure it. This is one of the best, richest, well-dated archaeological sites, and still it's poor to answer our questions. We have to admit that, the questions of why they started, what they were doing, but we don't notice a big shift towards domesticated animals in the way of pastoralism. We don't see any kind of shift. The people, as Stefan mentioned, died or moved on. We do see that in the period afterwards, there were people transiently coming through, but we don't see a big cultural shift as best as we can see it in the graves and in the middens that we have extensively studied and measured. It was a way of life that they were happy with. They saw cows. They didn't adopt them as best as we can tell as pastoralists. It wasn't a natural thing to do. People do things perhaps as long as they can when it works. And when it doesn't, and it really doesn't, and the climate has shifted on a decadal or greater time scale, they move on or die. That seems to be the best of that, but I would love to have lots of feedback on those conclusions. 2 main occupation phases is what I've found. Fairly abrupt boundaries, distinctive populations. The skeletal biologist is very much a bet hedger. And so further analysis on further numbers of crania has him hedging his bets on a link to southern Europe. He's gone to measure the populations on the Iberian Peninsula and Italy. But we still have the association, not just in terms of skull form, but also in terms of cultural practices. We've got the oldest evidence of filed teeth, and we also have incisor ablation that matches some of the burials from the northern Algerian sites dating to 25,000 years ago. So there is a link to northern coast of Africa. Whether it goes beyond that or not, we don't really know. And the continuity, there could be continuity of the populations of the second population. We see it culturally. So we see harpoons dated to the second period. It was our supposition that it was only the Aqualithic peoples, the Kiphian peoples, that were using harpoons. It looks like they were being used by the second population as well. We see burial practices now. We've got several burials. They start out actually flexed and then seem to loosen up sometime in the middle of the second occupation period. So there's cultural things that extend across, including tooth ablation. But there clearly are differences, noticeable differences in the second population. That first population took a big hit, no matter what happened to it. This is, I collected things in Niger, both large and small, both archaeological and paleontological. It is my hope that we develop a new national museum in Niger because there's so many things. They have Africa's humid period documented better than any other place. So it's my hope that we develop a museum in Niger for this material when ultimately it will return, where it will return. Thank you very much.